The heat of late afternoon hung heavy over the plains, the air thick with the faint tang of dry grass and horse sweat. Jedediah's gelding plodded along the narrow trail toward home, each step kicking up a ghost of dust that lingered in the low sun's amber light. He kept his gaze ahead, thinking of the cracked fence posts he'd need to replace before dark, of the troughs that would run low by week's end if the wind didn't shift east and bring rain. Life out here was measured in repairs and provisions, in the way a man learned to keep to himself. But then, like a shadow caught where no shadow ought to be, he saw her. She was leaning against the bleached wood of a milepost, half hidden by the tall sagebrush that pressed in around her. At first he thought she might be asleep, until he noticed the strange stiffness in her frame, the way her hands clutched her middle as if holding herself together. The hem of her dress was torn, a pale green faded nearly to gray, clinging to her knees with the dust of long miles. Her hair, dark as river silt, fell in uneven strands over her face. His horse slowed without command. Her head turned slightly at the sound of hooves, but the movement made her wince. There was something in her eyes, not the clear plea of someone begging for help, but the wary bruised light of someone who had been let down too many times to expect it again. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, raw from either wind or weeping. "No more pain," she whispered, like a prayer she didn't quite believe in. "My ribs are almost broken." Jedediah swung down from the saddle. She flinched at the motion, shrinking back against the post, but she didn't try to run. Close now, he could see the faint mottling of bruises peeking from beneath her bodice, the stiffness in her breath. He said nothing, not yet. Words had a way of crowding out truth if they came too soon. He crouched, hands resting loosely on his knees. Her shoes were scuffed thin, the laces frayed. One ankle bore a reddish scrape, the kind of fall on hard ground leaves behind. "How far have you come?" he asked, his tone low, steady. She shook her head, eyes darting to the road behind him, as though measuring the space between here and some place she'd fled. "I can walk," she murmured, though her trembling said otherwise. Jedediah stood and reached for her arm, slow enough that she could see the movement before it touched her. The muscles beneath her sleeve were tense, coiled like a snared animal's. With the care born of long years gentling skittish colts, he guided her toward the horse. She didn't resist, but her breath caught each time the motion jarred her ribs. He lifted her easily, setting her sideways in the saddle so she wouldn't have to twist. Her hands gripped the worn leather horn, knuckles pale. Then he swung up behind her, his arms braced loosely, leaving her room to breathe. They rode without speaking. The trail narrowed where the grass grew tall, brushing against their boots, and the air smelled faintly of sage and sun-baked soil. He could feel the slight tremor of her frame against his chest, not from cold. There was none, but from some deep, hidden reservoir of pain. It was near dusk when the ranch came into sight, a low, weathered cabin crouched at the edge of open land, the hills rolling away behind it like a great wave frozen mid-rise. Smoke drifted from the chimney, faint and lazy, carrying the scent of pine kindling. His nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. No one here would ask her questions she didn't want to answer. He reined in at the front porch. For a moment, she didn't move, as if the act of dismounting would anchor her in a place she wasn't yet sure she could trust. He slid down first, then reached up for her. This time, she let him help. Inside, the cabin was dim, the walls stained gold by the light of a single oil lamp. The table bore the remnants of his midday meal, a tin plate, a crust of bread, and the coffee pot still half full. She stood in the center of the room, her eyes flicking from the narrow bed tucked in the corner to the rough-hewn shelf lined with jars. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair by the table. She obeyed, moving slow. He poured water into a tin cup and set it before her. She drank in small swallows, one hand still pressed to her side as though afraid her body might fall apart without the pressure. He fetched the old cedar chest from beside the bed and drew out a clean shirt, faded but whole. Lay it over the back of the chair. You'll need this till your dress can be mended. Her eyes lifted briefly to his, startled by the simple offering. Then she looked down again, fingers tracing the edge of the fabric. He set about heating water over the stove. The fire snapped softly, filling the room with the resinous scent of burning pine. She didn't speak, but he could feel her gaze on him, measuring, perhaps, the sort of man he was. When the water was ready, he brought it to her, along with a strip of clean cloth. The silence between them wasn't the heavy kind that chokes a room, but the tentative quiet of two people unaccustomed to sharing their air. He wanted to ask her name, but held back. A person's name was something they gave when they were ready to be known. Later, as the last rim of sunlight faded from the windows, he stepped outside. The sky had gone the deep rich blue of early night, a single star trembling above the western ridge. Behind him, the faint creak of the chair told him she had moved to the table, perhaps to eat the bread he'd left beside her cup. He stood on the porch a while, listening to the whisper of grass in the wind, and thinking of how some things arrive in a man's life without warning, like storms that rise from a clear horizon, or strangers who carry their pain in silence. Inside, she was safe for tonight. Tomorrow, that would be another trail to ride. The first light of morning spilled pale over the cabin walls, stretching long shadows across the rough plank floor. Jedediah stepped quietly from the porch, the air still cool enough to taste the night in it. Inside, he could hear the faint rustle of movement, cautious, like someone trying to make themselves small in a space they didn't yet claim. When he returned with the milk pail, she was at the table. The clean shirt he'd given her hung loose over her frame, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her hair was gathered in a hasty knot, leaving a strand to fall across her cheek. She had taken it upon herself to slice the loaf of bread, though each movement of her knife hand was slow, as though her body weighed more than it should. "You shouldn't strain," he said, setting the pail down. "I'm fine," she answered, but the words came out tight, as though pulled through clenched teeth. She kept her eyes on the bread. He poured her a mug of coffee, the steam curling between them. She accepted it with both hands, inhaling as though the warmth itself could stitch her together. No questions passed his lips, not yet. Out here, people had a right to their silences. The day passed in a rhythm both awkward and oddly steady. While Jedediah tended the corral, he caught sight of her at the window watching. When he returned to the porch, she was sweeping the floor, her small motions interrupted by the occasional wince. He didn't stop her. Sometimes the doing was part of the healing, even when it hurt. In the afternoon, a faint wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust from the south. He found her sitting on the low step outside, her knees drawn close, the loose hem of her dress brushing the ground. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "I can't stand feeling useless." He leaned against the porch post, arms folded. "You're not." A faint, almost disbelieving smile touched her lips, but didn't linger. When the sun dipped low, he brought out a basin and the clean strips of cloth he'd prepared. She hesitated before letting him help, but when she did, it was with a kind of quiet surrender that told him trust was not something she gave easily. He knelt beside her, his fingers gentle as he loosened the bindings around her ribs. Purple shadows bloomed across her skin, some fading to yellow, others still fresh. "Didn't happen all at once," she murmured. "That was worse." He didn't ask who. A man didn't need a name to recognize cruelty. He simply wound the cloth back into place, steady and sure, until the hurt was held firm. That night, she ate more than before, half a plate of beans and cornbread, though she pushed the last bite toward him. After the dishes were cleared, she lingered at the table, while he mended a bridle strap by lamplight. The ticking of the old clock filled the spaces between their breaths. Somewhere in the middle of the night, he woke to the sound of movement. He rose and found her standing by the door, her hand resting against the frame. The lamplight caught the side of her face, pale and still. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't turn. "Just needed to know the door's not locked." "It never is," he said. For a long moment she stayed there, the night air touching her hair, before she stepped back inside. The days that followed carried their own rhythm. She began to move about the cabin with a little more ease, though her breath still shortened with sudden movement. Jedediah repaired the corral fence, and more than once, she brought him a dipper of water without being asked. He noticed she'd started humming under her breath while sweeping, a sound that stopped whenever she realized he was near. One evening, a neighbor rode up, the first visitor since she'd arrived. Jedediah met him at the gate, the conversation low and brief. When the man's eyes flicked toward the cabin, Jedediah's stance shifted subtly, and the visitor looked away. He left with nothing more than a nod. "Inside?" she asked. "You don't tell anyone?" "Ain't mine to tell," he replied. Something in her shoulders eased, though her gaze stayed fixed on the floor. By the week's end, she could lift a small bucket without wincing, though he still carried the heavier loads. The bruises had begun to fade, but there was a shadow in her expression that hadn't yet lifted. One afternoon, as he was sorting tools in the shed, he heard her voice for the first time without that guarded edge. She was outside, speaking softly to the mare in the corral, her hand brushing its flank. The horse stood still under her touch, ears forward, and something in Jedediah's chest tightened. That night, she sat with him on the porch. The sky above them was painted with the last strokes of daylight, fading into the deep indigo of oncoming night. The air smelled faintly of mesquite and warm earth. "I'll go with you next time you ride into town," she said. His brow lifted slightly. "You sure? I can't hide here forever." Her voice was calm, but beneath it lay something taut, a thread of determination tied to a weight he couldn't yet see. The wind moved through the grass, whispering like distant voices. He didn't argue, just nodded once, as if agreeing to something larger than a trip for supplies. She kept her eyes on the horizon, the last light catching in them like fire about to burn. The morning they set out for town, the air carried the faint scent of distant rain, though the sky above was a hard, unbroken blue. Isabella rode beside Jedediah in the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles pale from holding them too tightly together. She wore the mended green dress, the tear at the hem stitched with neat, small work, her work, and the shirt he had given her folded in the basket at her feet. Her hair was drawn back in a simple braid, the dark sheen of it catching sunlight when the wind moved it. The road stretched long and open before them, its ruts deep from weeks of passing freight. Neither spoke much. Every so often, he glanced at her from the corner of his eye, watching the way she scanned the horizon. She wasn't looking for beauty. She was measuring escape routes. By the time they reached the town's edge, the sun was higher, pressing heat into the dust. The streets were narrow and uneven, the storefronts casting short shadows across the boardwalks. A few heads turned as the wagon rolled past, quick glances that lingered too long. Jedediah noticed the way Isabella's chin lowered, her eyes fixed on the space just ahead of the horse's ears. He pulled up outside the general store. Mrs. Carver, plump and keen-eyed, stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning, Jedediah." Her gaze shifted to Isabella, and in that single beat, her expression softened. "You must be helping him keep the place in order." Isabella managed a polite nod but said nothing. Inside, the smell of flour, dried herbs, and leather filled the air. She moved between shelves slowly, touching nothing, as if afraid her presence might disturb the order of the place. By the counter, Jedediah asked for coffee, salt, and flour. As Mrs. Carver filled the order, two women entered, their conversation cutting off when they spotted Isabella. They stepped aside but kept their eyes on her, whispering behind gloved hands. The words weren't loud enough to carry, but the tone was sharp, the kind that could slice through even the thickest skin. Jedediah's jaw tightened. He gathered the supplies, paid, and with a tilt of his head toward the door, guided Isabella out. She followed without hesitation, her shoulders squared but not stiff. On the boardwalk, the warm wind caught her braid, lifting it slightly. At the wagon, a young man stood idly near the horse, a lanky figure with ash-blonde hair, the blacksmith's apprentice. He nodded to Jedediah but kept his gaze on Isabella. "You all right, miss?" She gave him the faintest of smiles. "I am now." Jedediah climbed up to the driver's seat, the bench creaking under his weight. Isabella settled beside him, holding the basket of goods in her lap. As they rolled away, she glanced back once, not at the apprentice, but at the store. There was no longing in her gaze, only the measured watchfulness of someone noting a place that could hold either shelter or trouble, depending on the day. The road home was quiet until she spoke. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not letting them press." He didn't answer right away. The sound of the wagon wheels on hard earth filled the pause. "Not my way," he said finally. She nodded, the corners of her mouth hinting at something almost like relief. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had begun its slow descent, gilding the grass in a warm glow. They carried the supplies inside, placing them neatly in the pantry. The silence between them had changed, less the guarded quiet of strangers, more the companionable pause of people who shared the same space without needing to fill it. Later, while Jedediah split kindling near the shed, he saw her in the yard, hanging laundry. The wind lifted the damp fabric, pressing it briefly to her body before letting it fall away. She hummed under her breath, a tune too low for him to place. It was the first time he'd heard her voice shape music. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting back to her. There was a steadiness in the way she moved, a carefulness that wasn't hesitation but intent. She was learning the rhythm of the place, stitching herself into it one small act at a time. That evening, after the dishes were washed, she stood by the window, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade behind the hills. "I left because no one would believe me," she said quietly, almost as if to herself. "Even when I couldn't breathe right. Even when I couldn't lie on one side without pain." He didn't push for details. A man didn't need to know the whole of a story to stand beside the teller. When she turned from the window, her eyes met his, and for a fleeting second, he saw something unguarded there. Something that made him think of the way a skittish mare will lean, just slightly, into a hand it trusts. They stepped out to the porch together. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint chirr of crickets from the tall grass. Overhead, the first stars trembled into sight. She leaned against the railing, her fingers brushing the wood as if grounding herself. "Do you think it's possible," she asked, "to feel safe in a place that isn't yours?" He considered the question, his gaze on the dark horizon. "Safe's not about the land under you. It's about who'll stand between you and trouble when it comes." She let that settle between them, her eyes drifting westward, where the last light still clung stubbornly to the sky. For the first time since he'd found her by that milepost, her shoulders seemed to lower, as if the weight she carried had shifted, not gone but eased. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the grass with a sound like distant voices. Somewhere out there, trouble might still be waiting, but tonight the air felt still enough to breathe. She stayed beside him a while longer, both of them watching the dark come down, as though the horizon itself might tell them what was next. The day began with the kind of stillness that carried weight, the air pressing close, the sun sharp even in the early hour. Jedediah was in the yard mending a hinge on the barn door when the sound of hooves reached him. Steady, deliberate, the rhythm of a rider who knew exactly where he was going. He straightened, one hand resting lightly on the hammer, and turned toward the road. A lone figure approached, dust lifting in faint swirls around the horse's legs. As the rider drew near, the shape of him sharpened. tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat despite the heat. His face held the kind of confidence that came from ownership, not of land, but of people. Jedediah felt Isabella before he saw her. She'd stepped out onto the porch, the faint scrape of her bare feet on the boards carrying to his ears. The man reined in at the gate. His eyes slid past Jedediah to find her, and when they did, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Thought you'd gotten far enough to disappear, Bella." Her breath hitched at the name, her hands curling into the fabric of her skirt. Jedediah moved to the gate, resting one hand on it, as though it were nothing more than habit, but his presence between them was deliberate. "You've come a long way to talk to someone who doesn't want to see you," he said. The man leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "That's where you're wrong. She belongs to me." Isabella's voice came then, low but steady, each word carrying the echo of nights she'd held inside too much. "Belonging to you meant being bruised where no one could see, being told to keep quiet when I could barely breathe. It meant wondering if I'd wake up the next morning." A faint tremor passed through her, but she didn't look away from him. The rider's smirk faltered, just slightly, though his eyes hardened. "You've got no proof," he said, as if the absence of witnesses could erase the truth. Jedediah's tone stayed even, though a thread of iron wove through it. "Proof's not the kind of thing I need. She's under my roof. She stays." The silence that followed stretched taut, the air between them tight as a drawn wire. The man's gaze shifted from Jedediah to Isabella and back again, measuring the ground he'd have to cross to reach her. Something in his calculation changed. Without another word, he tugged the reins, turning his horse with a flick. The animal's hooves struck hard against the dry earth as they rode away, the sound carrying until it was swallowed by distance. Isabella stood motionless on the porch, her chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Jedediah approached slowly, giving her the space to move if she wanted. She didn't. "He's not coming back today," Jedediah said. Her eyes flickered, as if testing the truth of that, before she let out a long, uneven breath. "I thought if I left, I could be invisible." "Not out here," he replied. "But you can be safe." They went inside. She sank into the chair by the table, her hands curling around the edge as though holding herself steady. Jedediah poured her a cup of water, setting it within reach but not pushing it toward her. She took it after a moment, sipping slowly. The rest of the day passed in a quiet that was heavier than usual. Jedediah worked near the cabin, repairing the chicken coop, but his mind stayed fixed on the possibility of the rider's return. Each creak of the windmill, each groan of the wood under the sun made his eyes lift to scan the road. As the sun began its slow descent, Isabella stepped outside. She'd changed into the shirt he'd given her days ago, the sleeves rolled high. In one hand, she carried a small bundle of wildflowers she must have gathered from the far edge of the yard. Without a word, she placed them in a chipped mug on the porch railing. He joined her there, leaning on the post. The horizon glowed faintly gold, the light settling over the land like a promise that might or might not hold. "You didn't flinch when he tried to speak over you," Jedediah said. She gave a faint, almost tired smile. "I've done enough hiding." They stood together in the lengthening shadows, the air cooling just enough to carry the smell of earth. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's cry rose and fell, thin and lonely. When the first stars showed, she turned to him. "If he comes back," he cut in gently, "then he'll have to get past me again." Her gaze lingered on his face for a long moment, as though trying to read what kind of man made promises without flourish, but with the weight of certainty. Then she nodded, the smallest motion, yet final in its way. The night deepened around them, and though the road lay empty, the sense of something unresolved hung between the dark hills and the quiet cabin. Neither spoke of it, but both knew the story had not yet finished writing itself. The days after the confrontation drifted by without sign of the writer. Yet the air held a quiet watchfulness that neither Jedediah nor Isabella spoke of aloud. It was like a low hum in the background of their days, something felt more than heard. Jedediah kept to his work, mending the sagging fence lines, tending the stock, checking the troughs. But his eyes often wandered to the long road stretching from the horizon. Isabella moved through the cabin with a deliberate steadiness, her steps unhurried, her tasks measured. The bruises on her skin faded week by week, but the ones in her memory lingered, slow to loosen their grip. As summer deepened, the sun baked the land in its relentless hold. The grass curled brown at the edges, crisp beneath a boot heel, and the earth itself turned hard, cracked in places where the wind had scraped it bare. One evening, Jedediah returned from the far pasture and found her kneeling at the base of the porch steps. She was bent over a narrow strip of soil, where the morning shade lingered longest. Her hands pressed small seeds into the earth with care. When she looked up at the shadow of his frame falling over her, she said only one word: flowers, as if no further explanation was needed. Over the next weeks, the soil began to show the shy green of new shoots, small but determined. She tended them in the earliest hours, when the air still held a trace of night's coolness. Her hands brushed over each fragile stem, as though committing their growth to memory. Jedediah sometimes stood on the porch in those moments, not watching the plants themselves, but watching her, watching how her shoulders no longer curled inward, how her posture began to open to the day. They went to town together twice more. The stares still came, the whispers still floated at their backs, but she met them differently now, not with lowered eyes, but with a steady gaze that made most turn away first. Mrs. Carver greeted her by name this time, her voice warm. Even the blacksmith's apprentice, lanky and shy, tipped his hat without prying. It was on their third trip back from town that the words came. The wagon rattled over a deep rut, and Isabella reached out instinctively, her hand catching his arm to steady herself. When she let go, her fingers didn't stray far. "You've given me more than a roof," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the creak of the wheels. "You've given me a place to breathe." Jedediah kept his gaze on the road ahead, but something in his grip on the reins eased. "You've earned it yourself," he replied after a long pause. One heavy afternoon, the sky darkened in the west without warning. The wind shifted, carrying the electric scent of rain. A storm rolled in fast, spilling across the plains. Together, they moved quickly, ushering the animals into shelter. Rain pelted the dust until it turned to slick, dark mud beneath their boots. By the time they reached the porch, both were soaked through, their breaths quick from the rush. She laughed then, a small, surprised sound, as if it had been tucked away for years and had finally slipped free. He found himself smiling back, though neither of them said why. When the storm passed, they stayed on the porch steps, the last drops sliding from the eaves. The smell of wet earth rose all around them, rich and grounding. Her hair curled damp against her cheeks as she turned to him. "You ever think of marrying again?" she asked, not timidly, but as one testing the depth of still water. He didn't answer right away. "I've thought about what it means to keep someone," he said finally. "Not because you have to. Because you want to." Her eyes lingered on his longer than habit usually allowed. The moment sat between them like a stone in a calm river, still, yet altering the current. The next morning was clear, the air warm but easy to breathe. He found her in the yard, hanging a fresh-washed shirt of his on the line. The cloth billowed in the breeze, snapping softly. He crossed the grass toward her, stopping close enough that she lifted her gaze from the clothespin in her hand. "Stay," he said simply, "as my wife." It wasn't dressed in grand words or ornament. It was the plain truth, offered without condition. She stood still, the light breeze catching at the loose strands of her hair. For a heartbeat, she seemed to weigh the words as if they were something fragile she might crush if she held them wrong. Then she nodded. Slow, certain. I will. They were married in town a week later. No procession, no fuss, only Mrs. Carver as witness and the pastor with his worn Bible. Isabella wore her green dress, now mended so finely the seam was almost invisible, and a small sprig of the flowers she had planted was tucked at her waist. Jedediah wore his best shirt, its sleeves stiff from careful ironing. By the time they returned, the sun was leaning toward the horizon, stretching gold light across the yard. She stepped down from the wagon and stood still for a moment, looking at the cabin as if seeing it newly. Then she reached for his hand, not with hesitation, but in quiet claim. Inside, she placed the bouquet from her waist into the chipped mug on the table. Outside, the flowers she'd planted weeks ago had bloomed in her care, bright against the worn wood of the porch. Jedediah stood in the doorway, saying nothing, but knowing the truth of it. The cabin no longer belonged only to him. That night, they sat side by side on the porch bench he had built weeks before. The stars came slowly, pricking the dark sky one by one. She leaned into him, her head resting just beneath his shoulder, the steady sound of her breathing blending with the night. Sometimes, she said softly, you don't know you're home until someone tells you can stay. He looked out toward the west, where the horizon faded into deep shadow. Trouble might one day come down that road again. But tonight there was only the quiet promise of what they had chosen, and the steady weight of her beside him. And for the first time in years he felt the land was not merely something he worked. It was something he shared. Dear friends, before you ride off, tell me, where in this wide old world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these Wild West tales wander. And if Isabella's quiet courage and Jedediah's steady heart touched you, leave a few words for the kind of love that protects without chains and heals without hurry. If you believe in second chances, in homes built on trust instead of fear, go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe. Because the next story might just be even more stirring than this one.